Probably hear me, but that's okay. All right. And we're back on the dev stream. My name is Nick Taylor. I'm a lead software engineer at Forem. Forem is a software that powers dev.
And I'm Christina. I'm the open source community manager here at Forem. And today we're going to be talking about Cypress and how we use Cypress at Forem, at least how Nick and the rest of the team uses Cypress at Forem.
Well, hopefully I can explain things to you in a hopefully understandable manner, Christina. Um, yeah, so we're gonna we're gonna talk about Cypress, what it is. I'm gonna go through how we're set up on Forum with it. But then we're gonna go through some tests that we have already written, but just want to explain the breakdown of what we're doing in the test and why we do things a certain way. And then we're going to look at Cypress custom commands, and we have some
Mhm.
examples in the Forum code base already. So yeah, we'll take a peek at those too. So I guess the first thing is, and this isn't even Cypress specific because there's other frameworks that do these kinds of things. But what is end-to-end testing exactly? So think of, if it's a term you've never heard, uh, it really, what it really boils down to is you want to be able to run some tests as if someone on your website was actually using the website. So
Mhm.
if I'm a user on a e-commerce site like Amazon, for example, and I add stuff to my shopping cart, we want to actually repeat those steps and yeah, go ahead with that. Just because we want to be as close as possible to what a real user would be doing. Uh, hey, Justin John 101 in the chat
I
there.
have a quick question, which
Yeah.
maybe you have an answer for. Uh, so I do know Cypress a little bit. I taught it for a little bit when I was at Lambda, and I haven't used it in a while. But from what I remember of end-to-end testing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, when you have it so that, like, say, like you just mentioned that, you have a card on your website. A lot of times with end-to-end testing, if I understand correctly, you want to test the things, one, that the interactions users are doing the most, but also the most important for the website to like work. And then also end-to-end testing can be a bit like slower. So you maybe don't want to end-to-end test like every interaction on a site. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are good points. So you definitely want to test critical flows in your application. So for example, can somebody log in? Can they log out? Can they sign up? Anything to do with money, for example, if it's e-commerce or some kind
Mm-hmm.
of payment system, you absolutely want those things working because, and especially when folks change code, having these tests in place will, if there's a regression when somebody makes changes to some of that code, the end-to-end test will catch it in these critical flows. So it's super important because, if nobody can log into your site because somebody made a change, even if they tested it
Yeah.
locally and it worked, it's not really good. So you definitely want to prioritize critical workflows. The other thing that you mentioned is, uh, because you're running these tests like a real user, they
Mm-hmm.
will run a little slower because, for example, clicking into something, typing, these things are all automated, but it like literally types it on the screen.
Yeah.
So they will be slower than something like unit tests, but uh, it's worth it, but there are trade-offs. So like any kind of testing you do, we're not going to touch on other testing today because it's a bit out of the scope of what we're talking about. But
Yeah.
you need to find a balance between like unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the other thing too is when you do end-to-end testing, you're actually covering a lot more ground. So, for example, if I had a unit test which calculates I don't know, sales tax on an e-commerce site, you can test that function to say like when I get a certain price based on this country and like state or county, it always returns this price. you know, those tests can be passing no problem, and then all of a sudden your website's still failing because something else is wrong. So it's still good to have unit tests for
Hmm.
certain things, but you kind of want to have everything running in like what somebody's actually doing. There's a
Yeah.
lot of memes about tests, like the tests are working. Like I can think of one offhand. There's two windows in a corner with handles, and you try to open it, but you can't do it because of the way
Yeah.
it was built. Stuff like that, and it is true. And like
Drawers.
so yeah.
They're in the corner.
Yeah, exactly. Or I think there's another one, like it says push pull or something. I can't
Yeah.
remember. But anyways, but yeah, so they're super important, but like any other tests, there is a maintenance burden as well. So you do have to maintain the
Hmm.
tests as things change in your system. That's not a bad thing, but it's just something to be aware of. And this is where the you have to be cognizant of where you want to write tests. And this might change over time. For example, in the Forem code base, we only got end-to-end testing. I actually opened an issue before I was even working there. Like I think it's like
Yeah.
almost 3 years ago, but I finally got it up and running. I think in December, and then I had to do a couple tweaks in
Yeah.
January. But prior to that, we had our unit tests for stuff like functions, like I was mentioning, but we had a lot of component tests too. We use Preact
Hmm.
in the front end for the user facing part of any Forem instance. So since we've added some of the end-to-end tests, there's actually been some component tests that we've removed because testing it within the actual application when it's running is good enough. Uh, we have
Hmm.
other stuff like this, our components in our design system, like the buttons and like kind of base building blocks for building out components. Those we still have component tests for because they're what other things are built off of. Um, Also, I'm turning to my left talking because I'm gonna be sharing my whole screen today, so my Discord is on the
Yeah.
left. So, anyways,
Just
that's
one question real quick, and you'll probably, Nick will probably get into this more as we start talking, but the question was, when did you run Cypress? Dev, CI, staging, prod, etc.
yeah,
Is the
for
question.
sure. No, for sure. Yeah, can definitely answer that, and it's a good segue to kind of go into the next part. So,
Before you
for
do, and I know
yeah,
I'm interrupting you, but I just want to say this real quick. For anyone who doesn't know Cypress, I don't know if you've used Test Automation University before, Nick, but it is a great site. They have all kinds of courses on
okay,
testing. It's run by Angie Jones, who's amazing with testing stuff. Uh, she's the one that kind of started it, and it's
yeah,
free, which is even better. So I'm gonna drop a link, and they do have a Cypress course. They have Cypress. They have Jest. They have Mocha Chai. I think all of those types of ones, and then they have stuff that's not just like JavaScript centric. They
okay,
have like Java and all kinds of things. So definitely check it out. Yeah.
cool,
Okay,
cool.
go ahead, Nick.
And I was gonna say also, if you don't know who Angie Joan is, I think is it Tech Girl 1908 on Twitter? I
Something
can't
like that.
remember.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tech girl. I can
Maybe
drop the
drop
link.
her, yeah,
Yep.
because aside from testing, Angie Jones will probably also drop air frying tips if you're into air frying.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's
I
true.
got an air fryer at Christmas time, so anyways, been using that a lot. Um, but getting back to yeah, so where do we run it and stuff? So we run it as part of our CI/CD pipeline. So anytime a pull request goes up, it runs. When we deploy to production, it runs. And in those cases, because you're running it in a container, we use Travis CI. It's running in a container. You don't have a screen, so there's no visual browser. It uses a headless browser. This is a setting in Cypress, so if you use Cypress run instead of Cypress open, it will run it as headless. Headless browsers have become pretty popular in the last few years. They they might have existed for longer than that, but um, they're used in other tools like Puppeteer, Playwright, which is a cross-browser version of Puppeteer from Microsoft. But they all use headless browsing.
Hmm.
So we run this in our CI/CD pipeline, so that's continuous integration and continuous deployment. And if things fail, we don't ship, or you can't merge a pull request. Um,
Yeah.
this is super
Which
important
we had
when,
some failing ones today, right?
yeah. I fixed the flaky test, and I tested it a ton of times, and then it's still flaky again. So there's something in there um, that I still got to look into. Suzanne, my coworker, had to disable it. Um, the other thing is that's great when we're using CI/CD, but when we're building out a feature or fixing a bug, like how do we run it as well? So as I was mentioning, Cypress is able to run with an actual browser, not just headless. And they
Hmm.
have all these nice tools where you can, I'm going to share my screen just so we can start
Hmm.
seeing some things here. Just give me 2 seconds here. I want to share my whole, no, I want to share my whole screen
Yeah,
here.
I really liked, as you're doing that, I really liked Cypress just because of like the visual feedback they give you, especially as someone who was like teaching people Cypress. It was nice to be able to just like see what was happening as they were setting up their tests. So Cypress is really cool in that respect.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, give me 2 secs here. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now. Let me know if you see the VS Code. Should be popping up. I'm on my browser now.
Yeah, right now it's just your browser.
Yeah,
There you go.
okay, cool.
That's it.
All right, so I'm gonna just locally we run it with the browsers I was mentioning with tools. I'm gonna start it up. So let me type the full command because I have some aliases here. But we use yarn, so I'm gonna run yarn, and it's an npm script called e to e.
Hmm.
I'm just gonna zoom in one more time. I think that'll help. There we go.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay. So first off, we have a script to check if everything's up to date or not. I just pulled latest from master before the stream, which was probably a bad idea. Um, so but I've written this script here that does these checks. Let me hide this part for a sec. So it's a little script just to do some initial checks. Like we're a Ruby on Rails app primarily, so I'm checking if all the Rails gems are up to date. If they aren't, I
Hmm.
stop the end-to-end test locally, and then I tell you literally what to do, and then you can do that. It checks if the npm dependencies are up to date, and will update
Hmm.
them if they aren't, and then it will actually start doing things. So I'm gonna run what it told me to do, which was bundle install. It shouldn't take too long. So this is just updating the Ruby gems. This is not something that will happen all the time when I'm running the end-to-end test. It's just that's my bad for
Hmm.
getting latest right before the stream. But it's a good thing to mention because we have this script in place. Just I wanted to remove as much friction as possible for folks that would be writing tests. So
Hmm.
that's why I created this script, and I got some good feedback from some coworkers about some things to add in here. So you see here now it's doing a bundle check, and it passed this time. That means all the Ruby gems are up to date.
Hmm.
Now it's just running yarn install because there's a few things out of date. This runs should run pretty quickly. And then once that's done, it's going to ask me if I want to set up a test database or not. So when we're running the end-to-end test with a full application of Forem. So think of it like a mini dev 2 running on your local machine, but we're using
Hmm.
a test database. The test database is used for other Ruby on Rails tests, but we use it for the end-to-end tests as well. So now it's going to say, do I want to create a test database? I'm just going to say yes. This is typically something, if you're working in the Forem code base, you only have to do it once, or if you've made a lot of changes and you've gotten latest from the code, like from the main branch, or you're updating your branch that you're working on in a pull request. I'll update it those times as well sometimes. There's some scary errors here, but this has nothing to do with the end-to-end test. It's just some deprecation warnings from some Ruby gem. So you
Okay.
can see here it's saying it's dropping the database called Forem_test, and then it's creating it. And so then this is going to give us a brand new database, and it's going to have an actual application running in a second here. Once it starts up Cypress. Again, like I said, I'm updating the database right now. It normally doesn't take this long for the end-to-end test to start up.
Yeah.
Um, there's some improvements that I'm probably going to do here over time. Right now, what it's doing is it's building the Rails application here. So
Hmm.
this is the asset pipeline for anybody familiar with Rails. So it's building the CSS. It's concatenating any JavaScript that's there using the Rails asset pipeline, but we also use Webpacker, which integrates Webpack with a Rails application. So that's what it's building here. We also use Post CSS for anybody that does any kind of CSS that you want it to be able to work in multiple browsers. It's a pretty
Yeah.
common tool. Okay, so now it's launching Cypress, and
Mhm.
I'll talk once that starts up. I'm gonna talk about how we get Cypress to load up here. So,
Mhm.
well, we'll talk about what's here so far. So you're gonna start off with this. I can't zoom in, unfortunately. This is
Yeah.
about as big as it gets because it's not a web browser yet. When you run the test, it'll have a browser, but what you see here is the Cypress test runner, and this won't appear when you're running the tests in the CI/CD environment, but when you're doing local development and you need to write tests or update tests for stuff you've been working on, you're going to be presented with this UI. And then what you
Mhm.
can see in here is there's a bunch of tests here. We have them grouped based on what makes sense to us. So like admin flows or anything related to the admin section of the application, for example. Login flows, this checks testing of logging in and log out. So I'm
Mhm.
just going to click on one. I'm going to do the login, and it's going to just run the test. You're going to see on the top right there, it says opening Chrome 89. Cypress, I think last year started supporting Firefox. It always supported the
Yeah.
Electron browser too, but you can even it even supports, I think, most Chromium browsers. I'm not positive. I know Edge shows up in here, which is Chromium based now. Um,
Mhm.
so the first time this starts up, it's a little slower because it's the web server starting up. But you're gonna see here, it's testing the login, and then it's gonna test the logout and everything. And I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it's just one test in this file. But what it did
Mhm.
was it should log in a user, and I can rerun the test here just with that little curved arrow, and it'll rerun it again. And then we'll see on the top left there, you can see if there's successes and failures. So there's a green check
Yeah.
mark on the top left there with one, meaning the one test kept passing. So that's great. Um, there's some neat things in here too. This is Cypress specific. So this is a real browser running right now. And
Mhm.
what you can see on the left here, this I can probably zoom in actually because we're in the browser now, I believe, unless Cypress. Okay, yeah,
Yeah, there you
I
go.
can zoom it in a bit. Okay, so we can see like it's not so much time travel, but you can see what happened in the page as we go along. I'm just checking out one of the comments in the chat from Typing Turtle. Curious if you had to do
Oh,
any
yeah. I
explicit
was just gonna
forks with the
ask you.
code base.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we haven't had to do any forking of the Cypress code base, if that's what you mean, Typing Turtle. I'll talk about it after when we talk about custom commands, but there's some open issues in Cypress that I have workarounds running for right now. For example, cookies aren't always being cleared. Um, I have
Mhm.
a custom command that makes sure that they clear. There's I don't have the link. We might when we look at the custom command, I have a link to the Cypress issue, but I know Cypress is working on adding something to their API called a like just a general session within the context of Cypress, which is supposed to fix all that.
Mm.
But yeah, TLDR, no, we have not forked Cypress and we haven't done anything aside from some custom commands. That's the only workarounds we've done. So getting back to here, you can kind of see on the left here all the stuff that's going on. There's some commands running here. So this is
Mm-hmm.
saying, and this is another library that we do use. You can link to that. I believe I sent you this link, Christina. We're using Cypress testing library. So Cypress testing library is using DOM testing library under the hood. And for anybody that's worked with React, you might be aware of Kent C. Dodd's React testing library. So that uses DOM testing library as well. So it gives you the same API as that. So we also use we're a Preact based application in the user facing part of Forem. So we use Preact testing library for our component tests, but I brought in Cypress testing library just so we could have the same APIs for querying stuff. So here we're saying I want to find all the login buttons with the text called login. So you can see when I click
Mm-hmm.
on it, it kind of highlights in kind of like a pale blue the login text. And then we're just saying get the first one and I want to click on it so that it'll go to the login page, for example. These are some network requests that the application is doing. And then we're doing a check here. Okay, are we on the right page? Then I want to find the login form. Again, you see that it's highlighting it. I want to get the user. That's the user is something else we'll get into. There's something called fixtures and testing, which is pretty common, and Cypress supports this as well. So it's a way to load information and put it in a variable, in this case user, so we can have access to email, for example, and a password. So if we come
Yeah.
here, getting the user, it's this is a test user I created called change password user forem.com, and then you're gonna see here it's typing in the password. Where is it? Okay, I'm going through it a little faster, but you can see it filled in the email and the password. So this is kind of nice to go through the steps because if a test fails, you can kind of
Yeah.
it'll show you a failure on the left, like in the step that is not working.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good way to help you debug things potentially. The other thing that I think is a lot more powerful than other end-to-end testing utilities libraries is because this is all JavaScript and it's running literally in the browser. In this test runner, you have access to the browser dev tools. So you
Yeah.
can literally see what's going on. So if I just clear the console here, and for example, I can even come and see the network here. So like if I restart it, you're gonna see network call, like literally all the tools you have when you're building a website are available to you in here. So you can see
Yeah.
stuff happening. You can inspect elements, like literally everything you can do with browser dev tools, you can do right within here. And that's super powerful, I find. Um, Maybe there's other tools that do that as well, but I haven't seen it. I worked with some
Mm-hmm.
Selenium-based browsers, Selenium-based end-to-end testing tools before, and I don't remember having that kind of capability.
Yeah.
So that's got so just to recap, so this is an actual test running that we loaded from the Cypress test runner. It shows you the steps, what it's doing on the left, and then it tells us whether things failed or passed. We can look at the different states of the actual test as it was moving along, and we can also use
Mm-hmm.
the browser dev tools to see what's going on under the hood. Okay, let me just close
So it's
that.
just kind of a
Okay,
question for Forum. Um,
yeah.
What did you, when you were bringing in the intended test at first, what did you feel like was the area that needed it most? Was there an area that needed the most coverage, or did you just, or was there lots of areas that just need, I know we have lots of tests, but did you feel
Yeah.
like there was an area that was like particularly important to make sure we had end-to-end tests on?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We still have a lot of places where we need to do end-to-end testing. The
Mm-hmm.
the goal initially back in December was to get Cypress in a place where it could be used and it would be integrated into our CI/CD pipeline. And then from
Mm-hmm.
there, I started off with an initial test, like making sure somebody could log in, and then I made sure that you could log out. I think those were the first tests I did. And then since then, we have some admin flows here. Arit, who's one of our coworkers, she had to do some work in there, so I suggested adding some things in there for end-to-end testing. We've done a lot of work recently. My awesome coworker Suzanne Aitchison, she added the mention autocomplete, which is a new feature, and we needed to add some end-to-end testing for that because it affected the editor and just the whole commenting system.
Yeah.
But all that says there's still a lot of flows that we need to put in place to test. So, and this is all open source, obviously, so you can take a peek at what we've done. If you go to the Forem code base, there's a Cypress folder, which is where Cypress by default will just install everything for you. That's where all our end-to-end tests are, so you can check that out if you want to. I believe I sent you the link for that
Mm-hmm.
to Christina. Um,
Yep. Pasting it right now.
but yeah, so we make sure that the login works, the logout. We've got a bunch of tests for the editor now. So like,
Yeah.
for example, if there's an invalid liquid tag, we had there was some regressions that occurred at some point. So we put some end-to-end tests in place for that too. But now there's tests like, uh, I fixed a bug I think yesterday or the day before where there was a regression where when you want to say I want to undo my changes in my blog post because we save things with local storage as a handy
Mm-hmm.
mechanism, and that wasn't working. So I put some end-to-end tests there to make sure that it persists what you have in local storage, and if you want to remove it, make sure that you can create an article and then load it up in there, stuff like that. There's still a lot of flows to do here, but like you were
Mm-hmm.
alluding to at the beginning there, Christina, these tests do take longer. We
Yeah.
don't necessarily want to write an end-to-end test for literally everything in here. So it's
Yeah.
really, you know, it's subjective, but like we want to just get the most bang for our buck with these tests wherever we can. That makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. You know, there's a whole other topic that we're not going to talk about today, but there's like, you can test visual regressions. Like I know Angie Jones's
Yeah.
company, Apply Tools, has that. There's Percy, which is a tool we tried last year, and I can't remember why we pulled it out, but we did. Um, we also use Storybook in the application to build out our components that are Preact based. And
Mm-hmm.
I know the folks behind Storybook, there's a company, I can't remember if the name of the company is Chromatic or not, but they have a tool called Chromatic that does visual regression testing too, like even
Mm-hmm.
colors and stuff like that. That's something we haven't even done yet, but that's just another thing that you can consider. Um, yeah, so that's kind of the test runner here. Now, the thing I wanted to talk about too is like, how are we getting this all to run? So there's a package called it's a Ruby gem called Cypress Rails. It's on GitHub. It's open source. It's from the wonderful people at Test Double, which I believe is run by Jeremy Searles, who's pretty well known in the Ruby community, from what I understand. I'm not a Rubyist really. I dabble in it when I need to in the code base. I'm mainly in the front end. So we use that, and what it does for us is it does a lot of things. And this is another important thing to bring up. So when we're testing, you want to set up your test, but say for example, we create a user,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have some other test where we want to check like what happens when there's no users in the system. If we run that other if that other test runs first that creates a user, for example, that other test will
Right.
fail. So what we need to do
Yeah.
is we need to set up the test, and then we need to tear it down with actual data. And
Mm-hmm.
I iterated on this a few times. I spoke to uh, some of the folks who know Ruby really well on the team, like Josh Pitts and Rhymes, Michael Cole, and I started off initially with we would seed some data, and that would load up, and you would
Mm-hmm.
have this data available to you. And then the idea was to just kind of reset the database to what it was. And there's uh, there's a Ruby gem called Database Cleaner, I think, but you can also run a Rails task to truncate the database, which basically means go back to what it was before you ran the tests.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, well, no, it just empties everything, and then we could reset the data. But the problem with that was it ran really slow, and we have to be mindful of how long these tests take because they are running in the CI/CD pipeline, and
Yeah.
the longer as we add more tests, whether they're end-to-end tests, unit tests, or whatever, that time is going to go up over time. So having slow setup and teardown is a big deal. So I finally came across this other gem called Cypress Rails, and he does something I think it's pretty clever. He's able to start a database transaction, and so if folks aren't too familiar with databases, if you're more on the front end, um, you can do a bunch of action, like a bunch of modifications in a database, and you can wrap them in something called a database transaction. So if anything in there at some point fails, you can say, I don't want to actually commit any of those things to the database at all. I want to do something that's called a rollback, like something didn't work, so roll back all the changes. So think of this like imagine you're creating a new user and it creates the user ID, and then it's adding other stuff to another table in the database, like some profile information. Maybe it creates the user, but for whatever reason the profile information doesn't get inserted into the database and it fails. um,
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to actually create that user then, because you're going to be missing information about that user. So if you can wrap that in a database transaction, this is supported in all relational databases. For NoSQL databases, I don't know if they support this notion or not. So, uh, so what Jeremy did was he said like, we're gonna start up the website, which his Cypress Rails gem starts. It runs Cypress. It creates this test server for you. It loads up like your entire Rails application. We have a bit of seeded data that we will load up at the beginning of the end-to-end test. But what happens from
Mm-hmm.
that point on is anything you do that will modify the database, a transaction is started. You run your whole test, and then once the test is done, it rolls back all the changes. So you basically never end up with anything actually going into the database, which is what makes
Mm-hmm.
the setting up and the tearing down super fast, which is
Yeah.
really important. Really important. Uh, yeah, that's right. TK rollbacks make me feel way safer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, TK is a buddy of mine from my virtual coffee group. So yeah, so I thought that was just a really cool way to make these tests really fast. Now, there's some drawbacks to that, at least in our case, the way we do
Mhm.
things at Forem. So uh, we currently use Elasticsearch for search in the application. So if you're using the search bar up top, or if you are, like for example, using the mention autocomplete, that's searching users through Elasticsearch, or if you go to the reading list, which we recently cleaned up to make it super responsive for our mobile adoption. Nice segue there, thanks. Uh, um, all those things use Elasticsearch, and at the time when I was setting this up, because I don't typically work on the back end, I didn't know how things were being inserted into the Elasticsearch index. So I'm not going to go too much into Elasticsearch, but it creates indices that allow you to search things. So like maybe it creates a user index and it adds all the users in there, and it's super fast to find them that way. But what happens is, for example, because I had to write some end-to-end tests for the reading list when I did all those responsive changes, is when you create an article, for example, it gets inserted into the database, and there's something it's a post commit hook. So when the data is actually put into the database, the commit, there's in Rails they have, because it uses active record under the hood. It has a function you can call called, I think it's just called post commit. I can't remember. And at that point, it says, okay, I have this article. I just added it to the database. Now in this post commit, I want to add it to the Elastic index so that it'll be able to be found really quickly. And that works perfect in the application. The problem in the test scenario, my voice just cracked. I'm 14 again, sorry. Um, is I think it's
Sorry,
because I
my nephew is in that phase right now. That's what it just reminded me of. Poor nephew.
it reminds me of it's a really old Simpsons episode, but the kid that works
Oh,
in the restaurant, he's like, "Sir, your
yeah,
taco's ready."
yeah.
um, anyways, um, like I was mentioning, when we run the end-to-end test, we start a transaction, and once the test is finished, it rolls it back. So nothing ever gets inserted into the database committed. So because nothing ever gets committed, the post commit function never gets called and never adds anything into Elasticsearch. So when I started
Hmm.
writing some tests where it was actually using Elasticsearch, I didn't
Hmm.
realize why I was getting these errors. Like it was telling me nothing was being returned. And then
Yeah.
after digging a bit and then speaking to with some of the backend folk, like, oh, okay, this makes complete sense. And we're rolling back the transaction, nothing's ever committed, so that's why there's nothing there.
Yeah.
So this is also where fixtures come into place. So I'm gonna this will let me open up a reading list here. Just 2 sec.
Hmm.
Uh, close this. Okay, so here's our reading list end-to-end test. I'll talk about, this is a custom Cypress command here, test setup. We'll talk about the custom command shortly.
Hmm.
But Cypress has this function you can call called fixture. And you can say, I want to load a fixture. So this is a file. So if I just go to here and open it, it's a JSON with information that you want to load into that fixture data. So this is how I'm able to log in. So I can say, I want to load that JSON file, and it'll become a JavaScript object, and it will be called user. And that's this part here, the dot as user here, that's called an
Hmm.
alias in Cypress. So what's happening here now is psy.get is probably the most used command in Cypress.
Yeah.
It's to say
Yeah.
just go get something. It could be an element on a page, but it could also be to grab an alias. So this is saying, get me the fixture data. So that's gonna pull in this information, and then once it's read the file, I'm gonna have access to it as a user object, and I'm going to use that user object to call my custom Cypress command login user here. And that's how it's able to, when you saw on the screen before, when it typed in the user and the password,
Hmm.
that's where it was coming from. You could literally type in the username and password every time, but that doesn't really scale well, like in terms of maintaining the tests. Like, what if at some point you change the username or you change the password? You would have to go everywhere in the code to do that. So
Yeah.
having the alias using the alias and loading a fixture like a file like this,
Mm-hmm.
it's super handy. That's one way to use the fixtures. Another uh, another function that Cypress provides is called Psy Intercept.
Okay.
This used to be, I believe it used to be called Psy.route, but since I think
Okay.
version
I
6, it's
know
called
what
this.
Psy.route is, but I didn't know what Psy.intercept is. So
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So and the name intercept I think fits a little better because that's really what it's
Mm-hmm.
doing. So what what this call here is doing is it's saying when my test is running, at some point it's going to hit a URL in the actual application called search/reactions and that whole query string here.
Mm-hmm.
This ties into what I was saying about Elasticsearch. We don't have anything in Elasticsearch because of the database transaction rolling back that I mentioned about in tests. So
Yeah.
what we can do is we can say like, whenever somebody hits this URL here, I want
Mm-hmm.
to I still want it to work like it would in the application, but I'm gonna intercept it and I'm gonna say like, okay, you wanna hit that page, I'm gonna return you this as the payload, for example. So if I come here,
Okay.
it's gonna return me this JSON object, which is what it really does in the application. But because we don't have
Mm-hmm.
anything in Elasticsearch running,
Yeah.
we're we're faking it for all intents and purposes. But this is actually uh, uh, folks, I'll probably go on a few tangents here, but
Mm-hmm.
it's good to mock things in testing, but not too much. But this is like a
Mm-hmm.
valid use case where we know Elasticsearch works in the context of how we're running the tests. It's not returning anything because of the rollback. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good use of loading a fixture to say, give me back some fake data so we can do the actual test.
Yeah.
Um, Again, here you're going to see we're using the .as, which is an alias again. So you'll see down lower here, we're doing some things. We're trying to, I'll talk about Cypress testing library in a minute, but we're saying like, wait for the empty reading list. So this is saying, wait till this web page returns back with a JSON payload. That's what the
Mm-hmm.
sci.wait for is here. And it's saying wait for that URL to be done. So it's just saying wait on the alias. You could probably put that whole Psy intercept in there, but in terms of readability, it'd be a little harder, I think.
Yeah.
So this is saying we're going to the reading list page. Uh, I want to at some point load the empty reading list because that's what this test is. It's saying it should load an empty reading list. Um, we're loading, in this case, we're loading an empty reading list because we have a different screen when there's nothing in there. So we want to be able to show
Okay.
that. As I go down further, you'll see there's other tests. So like filtering by text. So
Mhm.
for example, if I come here, when it goes to search for something, it's going to
Now
return
there's your
me
reading
this
list.
information. Yeah. And this is literally what
Okay.
the application, like the real application, like Dev2 or Code Newbies is returning. Um,
Yeah.
and so this is allowing me to test it in the different scenarios when it's empty, when I'm filtering, if I have I have other tests here testing on small screens and stuff. There's a lot of commands in here. I don't want,
Yeah.
I want to try and stay focused here, but there's a lot of things here. Um, since we're here, there's another command called Viewport, and
Mm.
what this allows you to do is to literally resize the screen so that you could
Oh, that's
test,
cool.
for
Yeah.
example, like when it's responsive, the UI is different. So you want to expect certain things to be there and other things maybe not to be there.
Yeah.
And we do that because we have media queries that change the way the reading list looks, for example. Um, yeah, so these are just a bunch of tests. It's kind of the same recipe here. It's like we're intercepting some kind of search query, which is what is loading in the reading list. And then we're looking for things to do like filtering. Because like if we come to the real reading list here, you can see here uh, when I'm filtering on accessibility, for example, or advice, all these queries here, Like if I come
Mm-hmm.
into the dev tools, we'll do XHR because we just want requests for when we're filtering. So, and you can see here it's
Yeah.
responsive now. The links on the left turned into a drop down. But if I click on here and I say Ali, whoops, I should put all, I guess. If I go back to all times, why is my network tab not running? I don't know what's going on. Let me load the whole page again. Okay, I have no idea why my network tab is not loading anything at the moment, but we're live, so I'll just say, it works. I clearly have some setting off in my browser tools. Okay, all right, that's called improv. I think this is the most I've spoken on the stream in a while. So,
It's okay.
okay,
If you need a
yeah.
break from talking, I can ask questions.
I know. I'm just gonna take a sip of water, but
hmm
okay.
I
So
think the other command, I know you said there's like lots of commands, but I think another one I remember from like teaching and stuff, and I saw it in there is kind of talking about like the before each, and I know they have a
oh yeah,
couple of them, but I see the before each, just kind of mentioning what those are, maybe.
yeah. So this is, you might be familiar with this in if you use Jest as well. There's other testing frameworks that do this too. I think Mocha as well, Ava. It's a pretty standard thing, I think. But
hmm
what this means is, so I have this describe section, and that's describe in the context of Jest or Cypress is just to group things to say like these are a bunch of tests I'm going to run for a label I'm going to call small screens. And what's going to
hmm
happen here is before each of these tests run, so the it here is the actual test, it's going
hmm
to run this chunk of code before each test. So
Yeah.
in our case, it's saying make sure we intercept the reading list so that we actually get information. We're setting the
hmm
viewport because I want to set it for a small screen.
Small
Then we want to
screens.
go visit the page. And then I'm saying here, I want to wait to make sure that that search URL here gets returned. And then we can run the actual test. So
Yeah.
it's a way to just set up things for multiple tests. And there's an after each as well, which it's the same thing except for maybe if you want to do some kind of cleanup after a bunch of tests. So you could do that as well. There's I guess we're kind of just diving into Cypress all over the place, but Cypress also has a config function you can call, and this gives you access to stuff that's in the Cypress configuration, which looks like this. Um, so it will have information in here that you can access. So I could say, what else is there? I have another Cypress file. This is the developer one, which is empty because we don't need anything. But here,
hmm
it builds it. The Cypress config is built off of those configs I showed you, but also some stuff that Cypress will bring in. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing is the Cypress Rails gem. If I go back to that, just one sec, is it here? Yeah. Okay. Uh, the Cypress Rails gem allows us to define something. This is specific to Cypress, but if you preface some environment variables with Cypress underscore Rails underscore Cypress underscore,
hmm
uh, I believe that's how you can add additional things that the config will pick up. And
hmm
if we come back to, it's still open. Okay, I won't have it in the logs, but when Cypress initially starts up, yeah, I'm not gonna have, there's too much logs there. But when Cypress Rails starts up, it injects some things like it creates the base URL, which is
Okay.
it's like a localhost
hmm
URL with like a port that keeps getting changed all the time. Yeah, TK is saying he's loving the improv here. um, yeah, so the Cypress stock config is just a way to access things that are available in the configuration. I'm using the base URL here. I still, this is a side note, but I tried using this without this like this and like making it like just a slash, but for some reason, maybe I have to read up on it more, but Cypress wasn't able to find the slash search. Like, I think you have to put
Okay.
the full explicit address because
Yes. Yeah.
I I would have assumed like if you were running, if you were intercepting local stuff that's for your application, it would pick it up. But I guess you just always have to put the full URL. Um,
Yeah, from what I remember when I was teaching it, because I remember teaching the base URL, we would set that up in like a config so that you wouldn't have to put it out every single time. We would just like reference the base URL.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, that you had to put like the whole thing every time. And that's one of the reasons like a lot of people will create like a base URL so that you don't have to type that every single time. Like, I don't want to have to put this every time. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, the other thing, as we mentioned, there's a lot of commands that Cypress provides you with, but we're
Mm-hmm.
also using Cypress dash testing library. It's an npm package that allows us to use similar APIs from DOM testing library or React testing library, or in our case, we use Preact testing library in the front end. But uh, there's a few reasons to use this, and it's the same reasons that you use them to write component tests. So it doesn't guarantee that what you're building is going to be accessible, but the whole like testing library suite of tools, they promote the way the APIs are built. It promotes trying to find things in an accessible way. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
if we look, let me close the down there. You see here, I'm saying, whoops, I'm saying I want to find a role by role. I want to find by role, and I want to find the main role. So what this actually
Mm-hmm.
translates to is find me a main tag on the page. Now
Yeah.
the main area landmark is important in terms of accessibility. It ties into stuff like skip links, which is a whole other topic, but it allows accessibility tools and even just folks that like using the keyboard able to kind of be able to come to that main area potentially. And
Mm-hmm.
then so there's a few things here. By saying I want to find the main tag first, we're ensuring that like if ever somebody forgets to put one in a page or removes it, this test will fail. And then uh,
Yeah.
you know and then the other thing too is by saying I want to find the main tag, most of what you're going to be testing is within that main tag, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying find the main tag, and in there I want to find a piece of text that's called your reading list is empty. the
Yeah.
the find by text is also part of the Cypress testing library, and this is
Mm-hmm.
definitely handy when it's not necessarily like a button or a select box or something that you're trying to find. It's literally like maybe there's a just a span of text, maybe that just says your reading list is empty. So it's you can't really say go find a button with a label or something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
this is definitely handy, but there's other ways you can do
So is
it
that
too.
just so, sorry, just to kind of interrupt a little bit for the bringing that in, is that just so that you can skip having to do like dot contains and then saying what it contains, like if it's text or I think it was text, right? Or content
Yeah,
in Cypress, like
yeah,
because Cypress has kind of that functionality already, but it's shorter if you're just saying find by text or
Yeah, well, it is shorter, and there's the dot contains works fine, and maybe I would guess even under the hood, probably the Cypress testing library uses contains probably, or
Mhm.
maybe it uses the DOM testing library under the hood completely. I'm not sure, but what it
Yeah.
does is, and there's another link I had sent you before. It talks about creating resilient tests. It's a post from Kenzie
Mhm.
Dodds.
Okay.
The thing is, the reason why we're using the testing library, just like we're doing it with Preact testing library, is you can use selectors. Like I could say side.get find me an element on the page with a hidden class and I don't know a
Mhm.
bold class and I don't know a reading list underscore underscore main section or something, and
Mhm.
that'll work. But what happens if we do a refactor of like the styling and those class names change completely? Your entire test is going to fail. because those
Yeah.
selectors have changed. So by using like the text or finding by label, this is like really what a user would be doing. Where's the,
Hmm.
where's the filter reading list by text label, which is associated to some input, versus, find the class that says reading list filter. So this
Okay.
is one of the points of making things more resilient because, I mean, unless you rewrote the whole reading list feature, like this test shouldn't fail if I just happen to change some class names on some elements. So that's
Right. Because I
another
know kind of
reason to
in
be resilient.
their, I remember when teaching this, like in their best practices, like that was one of the things. Like, yeah, we would show them occasionally, like how to grab like a, something by a class or ID, but that was something we would talk about too. I think they have like you should put. I can't remember what it's called, like data Psy, or it's like a data attribute you're supposed to add, and then you name your stuff so that it doesn't change with your like classes and things. But again, this is
Yeah,
the find by text is a little bit easier than having to go through and add that to like every single element you want to test. So yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah. No,
useful.
the data psi attribute still exists, or like data dash test ID. You can decide what you want. I think they've defaulted to data dash test ID now. We do
Mm.
use that in some cases. Uh, you should try to use it sparingly though, because it's really only it will get you that element. Like if it'll say go, there's a side dot. This is from testing library, but you can do side
Mhm.
dot find by test ID, and then it'll
Mhm.
look for an element that has data dash test ID equal to whatever you're looking for. And that'll work, but you also
Mhm.
don't necessarily want to litter your entire code base with these. So
Yeah.
it's kind of more like I would consider that using that attribute as a last resort if you really aren't able to find an element, through the text or the label for whatever reason. Maybe you
Mhm.
need to use it in some case because just some weird scenario. But we do have
Yeah.
some in place. Um, and we actually had some for uh, I refactored this yesterday, but I didn't realize you could put a label on a form. I don't know why I didn't know
Mhm.
that, but I didn't. So we used to have a data dash test ID on, I think it was the article form. So like for when you're in the
Uh-huh.
editor, and then I was just reading up a bit for, I can't remember why, but I was like, oh, okay, I can use a label on a form. So then now I now I just switched it to find by role, and I said form, and then
Mhm.
you can do there's an object you can add here, and you can say like name, and this is what the label would be. So some
Yeah.
form label, and that's accessible.
Mhm.
And again, these things don't guarantee that you're going to write an accessible application. It just kind of promotes you to hopefully write some things accessible because it's easy. I've actually found
Yeah.
it easier to test by finding things that are accessible. So,
Yeah.
find by label text, find by role, they're like super helpful. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, so we still have some data test IDs in there, like I said, but I'm probably gonna do a sweep at some point and see if they really are necessary.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like a short overview of Cypress testing library. I think you linked to it, but there's
The only other
I
thing I
think
want to say for that, for like just Cypress in general, for people who just don't know, maybe you don't know testing or whatever, is that Cypress uses a lot of the commands you see, besides the ones that Nick's mentioning for the Cypress testing library. They mix Chai and Mocha, and so that's why I kind of mentioned the test automation university is because
okay.
they have those courses on there. And if you just kind of run through them like real quick, you suddenly see, oh, that's why they're using these commands, and that's what they're for, and that makes sense now. And so they combine a lot of the Chai and Mocha commands within Cypress.
Cool, cool. All right. So so far, we've kind of explained what end-to-end tests are. We explained how we use it at Forem, where we use it. So we use it in the CI/CD pipeline, the continuous integration,
Hmm.
continuous development, deployment, sorry. And also gave a quick demo of how we run it locally with the test runner here that you see. and then we can open a test and run it, or you can run all the tests. As I mentioned, you can run it in different browsers. I never run it in Electron because we don't have an Electron app, but I guess if your
Yeah.
app was Electron based, that would make sense. But you can see, like I was mentioning, Christina, even Edge shows up in here now because it's a Chromium
Hmm.
based browser. And we also have Firefox. So you can run the same tests in those other browsers.
And I think they have a
Currently,
GitHub
yeah,
issue for Safari, if I remember correctly, because we looked this up as a team. That they don't
yeah,
support it yet, but it's on the pipeline for something that they
yeah.
potentially support.
I have a feeling it'll probably pop in whenever, because Safari has a preview version that, like I know Jen Simmons, who's like a guru in regards to CSS grid and stuff. She
Hmm.
works at Apple now, and they're putting a lot of effort into the developer tooling. And I feel like probably the next iteration of Safari, like whatever version, when all that stuff comes out, maybe it'll integrate
Yeah.
better because like I know at least for browser extensions, because I used to work somewhere where I worked on browser extensions. Firefox is
Hmm.
basically adopted the Chrome-based extension API, and I believe because we have a Forem browser extension, for those that don't know, we released it to the Apple Store for Safari. It's a little more complicated because you have to build it with Xcode and stuff, but I think it's from what I saw, aside from like some boilerplate to load it up because it has to be considered a safe application in the Apple ecosystem. The APIs are, I don't think we changed anything, so it's like pretty. I feel like everybody's just gone the direction of like Chrome either did it right or you know
Yeah.
they're just more popular, so let's just go with that. That's my kind of feeling.
Yeah.
So I feel like things are kind of lining up that it would make sense that Safari support would land in here at some point with all those improvements to Safari.
Yeah.
But so we showed the test runner here. We talked a bit about Cypress testing library, the Cypress config. The thing I wanted to touch on now, and we talked about the before each and before after. So this is what you
Hmm.
can do to run before a bunch of tests or after tests if you're using after each. The thing I wanted to touch on now is a Cypress custom command.
Yeah.
So the first thing is like, why would you want a Cypress custom command? So uh, I'll give you one scenario here. I'm gonna rerun this test for you. So we're just gonna run that login test again.
Okay.
So with this login test, uh, it's probably pretty self-explanatory, but it's gonna see if a user can log in, and if it does, the test will pass. And except I've got, oh, there we go. I think because I've got so many apps running right now, my my
Yeah.
my computer's slowly coming to a grinding halt. I know it's in trouble when it's plugged in and the battery light's on the whole time. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so we can see here I ran a test to ensure that a user could log in. So you can see the login form here. Then we'll see that like information gets filled in there, and that's perfect. Now, if we're doing another test, for example, if I wanted, like we were talking about the reading list before, I need to be
Hmm.
logged in to test the reading list. The thing
Right.
is, like we mentioned at the start of the stream, it's important that these tests run as fast as possible because they'll
Yeah.
they'll be more and more as time goes on. So, like the setting them up and tearing them down it's super important to make them as fast as possible. So we did this test where we're testing that a user could log in and it's doing it in the actual application, like through the login form. So we know that works. If I go to the reading list, I want to save time because I know that the login actually works. So
Yeah.
I don't need to go to the login page, type in and then log in and then go to the reading list. We know that works. So all we need to do is we just need to literally do what happens when you submit the form to log in. And so
Hmm.
what that will do is it will, you know, It'll send the credentials of that user, it'll log them in, and then all the appropriate cookies and any other information related to that user will be loaded right away. And that makes the tests, when they start, really fast. And that's
Yeah.
why we have this custom command here, login user. So if we go to, there's a folder called, a file called commands.js in the Cypress/support folder. This is, you can put this somewhere else, but this is where Cypress puts it by default. So we have a bunch of custom commands in here, but I want to go to the login. Is that it? Yeah, here it is. Okay. Did I just go away from it? Oh, it's my computer. It's really chugging along now, which is
Yeah.
kind of depressing because this is a MacBook Pro 2019,
Mm,
which is supposed, I mean, it's no M1 now since they have M1s, but
yeah.
okay. So here's the command, and I'm just going to go back to the reading list test for a sec. So you're going to see here, we're saying psy.login user, and we're passing in a user object. And
Yeah.
just to recap quickly for those that might be joining the stream, there's fixtures, which is something pretty common in tests. So we're loading information about a user from a JSON file and putting it in this variable. It's using a Cypress alias here, which ends up being @user. And then this gives us the user information. So it's going to pass that into this command. And what this command does is, so to be able to say psy.login user, this is the API you have to do to add it. So you just say cypress.commands.add and the name of whatever your custom command is going to be. And then the
Yep.
second argument is the actual function that you want to run for that login user, for example. So there's a couple things here. So uh, you're gonna probably be wondering, like, how did I get this information down here to, like, how do I know that that's how it is that they sign in? I don't work on
Yeah.
the back end, and I mean, I'm familiar with it somewhat, but what I
Mm-hmm.
did was, well, I'll explain what's going on here, and then I'll explain how I was able to build this. So
Okay.
the first part is we've got the email and password coming in. This is a JavaScript function that's native in the browsers, and it's available in Node.js as well, because these tests, this part here is in Node.js. What this does is it encodes a string. So this will, for example, because when you have a URL, there's certain characters that need to be encoded. So like, for example, this %5d is actually a closing square bracket, I believe.
Okay.
So that's what this does. So like maybe the symbol or something will be converted to a different character, like these %ones here. And that's just so that it can be a valid URL to be passed. And then when you hit the back end, it knows to either Ruby on, I don't really know Rails that much, but it probably knows to decode these things, and like, so it's in a legible format so you can do something with it. Um, but what this is doing is it's using another command from Cypress called request. And what this allows you to do, think of it like the fetch command in the browser. So here I'm saying I want to do a post. So
Yep.
you can do like a get, for example, like if you're doing a search maybe. But a post is like when you want to send some information along with it that's not in the query string. So we're saying I want to send information to this URL called /user/signin in the Forem app. And this is the body I'm passing. And again, you're like, how did you get that? Well, I'll show you how, because I didn't even know what it was when I created it. So, and then that's going to send that and do a network request and do literally the same thing as if you were to put in the email and the password and click the login button. It's the action of the form. That's what this is. So
Okay.
hopefully I can get my things running. I don't want to show my password necessarily, but
Yeah.
let's see here. I'll I'll get it loading up, but I'll just show it from a different point of view. I just want to see why my network wasn't showing up with stuff. Show overview. Oh, that's why I had a filter on it. That's why stuff wasn't showing up. Okay, so you see how I'm gonna zoom this in a bit because it's definitely too tiny.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say search. Okay, so remember how I was talking about in the reading list there we were intercepting a URL?
Mm-hmm.
Here's that URL. So the way I was able to build that custom Cypress command to do a login was I found that that URL, which is the /user/signin. So I
Yep.
looked in the network requests here, I found it, I clicked on it,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was able to see like, okay, what's it sending and so on. And I was able to literally copy what's in here and put it
Mm-hmm.
into the custom command. And that's how I was able to actually do the real sign in.
Okay.
And the only things I changed were like I would inject the test username and password. So I took that part out of the string, which is that whole chunk
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
back
In the
here.
brackets there. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'm using this is a feature from JavaScript, but string template strings.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just saying inject that there, and so that all gets munged up into that one string that gets passed. So that's an example of a custom command, and it's a valid case where we want the test to run fast. We know logging in a
Yeah.
user from the UI works, so let's just do the actual network request, and then the actual test can run.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
That's cool. So, kind of summarizing for everyone, this is
Yeah,
this is of just my understanding, so that you can correct me if I'm wrong. So a
yeah,
nice thing about these custom commands, when you have a bunch of tests and you're doing stuff, and say like before we showed, hey, we were logging in, that was great. We wanted to go through the whole flow of like logging in. But then when you're actually logged into an application, you want to test other stuff. So people in a login state, you want to be testing things, and you don't want to run through all of those steps again because that takes time. We know
yeah,
it works, like Nick said. And so then you can create a custom command to do something like, okay, be logged in. So we use that before each that we had talked about. So before you run this test for the reading list, make sure you're already logged in. Don't go through all these other steps, just log in. And that's
yeah,
what Nick was able to do by grabbing the commands.
yeah. No, that's definitely summarized very well. Um, so yeah, so that was an example of logging in the user. There's other things like I want to set up test data, so I looked at like I went to the post editor to create a new post, and I
Mm-hmm.
did the same thing again. I looked at the network request when it actually creates the post, and I
Mm-hmm.
created a custom command for that, which allowed me to quickly create an article. And because we have again, getting back to what I mentioned at the start about how the tests are able to run fast, where we have a database transaction that rolls back, this article is
Yeah.
created, and then once the test is over, it gets rolled back, so it doesn't affect other tests, which is super important. Um,
Yeah.
so this is just another example of that. I think I think it was John Hill 101 at the start was asking about forking Cypress. We don't fork Cypress. I definitely
Yeah.
don't recommend forking a a project unless there's like a really really good reason to, because then you have to
Yeah.
maintain it. Um, but
Oh,
I
yeah,
did
true.
but I did run into one thing here. So if you take a peek, there's a custom command that runs before every test called test setup.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, this is
Yeah.
another custom command I added, and you can see here, I have the link here, so I'm gonna post it in the chat if my computer is not dead. Uh, it's like, I feel like typing is like molasses right now. Um, so there's
Got it.
this open issue that's been there for a while in Cyprus. Folks in many cases reported like cookies not clearing properly. It could be related to some like, I think there was some scenarios where it's saying like your test runs, but maybe there's some outlying network request for something else that happens to fire after the test runs and it brings the cookie back or something. There's like a few
Mm-hmm.
scenarios that they're all documented in that issue, but um, what I did was I created this custom command to clear the cookies to make sure that things are in a good state. Uh, so far, it's been holding up pretty well. So Psy.clear cookies is a Cypress command, and that's what they do under the hood, and it's supposed to work. But because of that issue, it clearly doesn't. So what I do in the test setup is I say clear the cookies, and then it looks silly, but I say at this point, get me all the cookies because
Mm-hmm.
what happens, it doesn't always happen, but in some cases, there's still cookies even after I clear them. So this is like an extra check. And then I say like, if there's at least one cookie, I'm gonna wait half a second and then I'm gonna call clear cookies again. And this, like I said, this doesn't always happen. Like other solutions that folks had mentioned were to say like do a wait right away and then clear the cookies. But I thought
Yeah.
since it's not always happening, again, this has to do with making tests fast because like every if we were adding half a second to every test all the time,
Yeah.
it would add up. So
Yeah.
I only do it if it's necessary, and then I clear the cookies again. This seems to be working.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I do in the test setup, and this is related to the Cypress Rails gem. So when you're running when we run the end-to-end test, we're running the Rails application in a test environment. So it's not production and it's not the development environment, which different things get set up in those environments. So when it's in the test environment, it makes this URL available to the application, and you run this at the start of the test, and this is the thing that does the database transaction rollback. Um,
Okay.
this is all open source, so you can go check the package that you linked to, Christina, to see this. But
Mm-hmm.
that's what that does, and that's just another example of the custom command. We have some others, um, but I think at this point, hopefully the idea is kind of clear why you might want to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
so.
so that's kind of everything in a nutshell. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more, obviously. Like we only have a certain amount of time to talk about these things, but but yeah, just to kind of recap, this is how we're set up in Forem. We're a Rails app, so we're using the Cypress Rails gem. We've gone over kind of the anatomy of a test a bit. We talked about
Mm-hmm.
Cypress testing library, which is what we use to access elements in a more accessible way, which potentially promotes accessible code as well in terms of like
Yeah.
markup and like area labels if you do need to area attributes if you do need to use them. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
try not to though. Prefer semantic markup before doing area attributes, but and that's yeah we kind of did a quick kind of quick tour of how to create a custom command where the commands are, and I think
Yeah.
that's all I got. uh I definitely feel dehydrated now.
Well, I actually learned a lot here, so I think that was really great. I've got to use some of these things, but never like all like even the fixture I didn't haven't used and stuff like that, and intercept the way it is now. So I think that's cool. Plus, I really like the custom commands. I think that's neat, uh, especially for
Cool,
just
cool.
convenience of some of the things. So I think that's great. Just one thing I wanted to say, Nick and I kind of talked about some things before we came on, just to keep an eye out for people is one, we have Jason Langsdorf on next week, and we will be talking about the Jamstack and serverless and all other things we don't really know. We just kind of get into lots of stuff. And also for just forum in general, we're going to be having an upcoming bug smash. Don't have the date yet. It will either be in March or sorry, in May or June. at the beginning of. But if you participate in the bug smash, you get a badge, particularly or and potentially some dev stickers. We'll have all the rules and everything soon, and it will be posted on Dev. And I will link to it at some point when we are actually streaming as well, and it is live. But that's just some things to kind of keep an eye out for. And yeah, did you have anything else you want to say, Nick?
No, that's it. Just stay hydrated, folks. Don't forget to drink water during the day while you're at your desk. I don't know.
got, I got this.
Don't. Yeah. No, that's it. Yeah. So like Christina said, we'll see you next week. And yeah, thanks for coming out, and talk to you later.
Bye.